Right, Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation. My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. But actually, what we generally do in the round, as regular viewers will know, we look at the world from the macro and micro position. So that means from some positions that people might turn around and say, well, that only affects a few people, or that's affecting the, as one used to say in England, the man on the Clapham omnibus, Joe Soap, or in these days, Joe or Josephine Soap. But then there's the other one that basically people generally think when they think of geopolitics is the interconnections, interdispersals, the big moving plates, if you will, between countries and states and empires and fiscal control factors that are at a very grand or global level. But I think it's important to look at both, because I think that both play into one, if you will, that the sort of bigger picture that one thinks they see when they look at the sort of stateswoman level, and then that picture that you look at when you look at maybe the owners of massive conglomerates like Amazon or Tesla or whatever, that then people think, yeah, geopolitics can see it, how states work against each other, how spies work from different states against each other, how spy catchers try and find the individual who's carrying or working, or individuals working on the behalf of the state against another state. That general understanding of geopolitics. But I like to sort of condense that down and look at it in the macro, because I think that the reality is that we're all part of this process, particularly now when our mainstream mass media actually feeds us a message. And that message then is what we carry through in our lives, which then allows, think of it this way, it's a building block that allows the people at the top to function in a way, often without being impeded, because they're giving us a story. And so why am I saying all of this today? Because that's what I want to look at today, actually, is I want to look at how the mainstream mass media, how it actually reflects what the leaders say, and doesn't really, or at least seemingly, make any attempt to educate the people to reality. I think where we are now is that the mainstream mass media, and I've tried to have this discussion several times with Firgas, who is often on the show with me along with Dr. Rachel, about how the mainstream mass media works. And she's been somewhat hesitant, and I can understand why. And we'll come back to it next week. This is, if you will, a critical thinking lonesome show. So it's me by myself thinking out loud, taking into account all these experiences I've had with the people in the mainstream mass media, and particularly with people like Fergs who, are within that system and have worked that system all their lives. Just how there is a kind of, even if you're not going with it now, there's a kind of a feel that, I don't know what it is. Is it that being an insider, you don't want to become an outsider? Is it that being an insider, you have connections with it? Or is it being an insider that you don't see the outside? Who knows? But the reality is that there tends to be this position whereby you're saying we're telling the truth. Now, I think what's really happening is that there isn't a clarity anymore from mainstream news readers, because they become now, actually in many ways, celebrities. So I think there's a particularly from the newscast readers, the anchors as the Americans would call them, I think that there's a feeling that they are now stars, and hence they don't really wish to give up that star status. And so therefore, to put your head above the parapet and question what they're actually reading, because they're just reading it, what they're reading, it maybe is something that you don't want to do, because you could be replaced and you could lose the role. So, and the role now, the other factor is the role is extremely lucrative. You know, you're talking about, I think, did Susanna Reid get millions when she moved across from BBC to ITV? So this is Susanna Reid is, for those who are not in the United Kingdom, Susanna Reid was one of the top sort of BBC individuals, newscasters, readers, whatever you want to do that terminology, and she moved across from there to ITV, which is independent, non-state apparatus, albeit that it, you know, runs to an idea that's generalised round about the same as the BBC, because the BBC now speaks really for a section of society that has been paid up in just the same way the Independent's been paid up, that isn't independent but is controlled by the mass media and controlled by, you know, your kind of Murdoch type press. So Sky would be, and others would be in other countries, as one can see. So really it's a matter of, with this mainstream mass media conglomerates, I think they're all much of a muchness, even when they're owned by the state now, particularly in the West, because the same people who run the state, or who are the, what should I use, who are the sort of, the face of the state, you know, your Prime Minister or whatever, oftentimes those people are part of the system, or have been co-opted into the system of owners of very big companies, powerful individuals. What could we call them? Barons. We could call them, I don't know. I think barons is probably one of the best words for the English perspective. I guess they call them maybe czars if you were going into Russia or something like that. But these individuals that own big businesses, be they in high tech, be they in finance, because oftentimes now it's finance. It's where these barons aren't making anything. They are, in fact, feeding off the system by making bets on what will happen in the fiscal system. So they're not actually creating. You know, the older baron, you could argue, was creating something, or at least pulling something out of the ground. If you want to, look at, I don't know, some of the oil barons, particularly in the United States in the past. They're pulling something out of the ground. Your Carnegies are doing something. Your Fords are making vehicles or whatever. Henry Ford. So now I think these people, don't get me wrong, you do have your Elon Musks and your Teslas and his SpaceX and whatever. So that makes up. You do have a very good, don't get me wrong, a very good commercial idea put up by Bezos to bring people all the goods that they require in a moment's notice. So they are creating. There's no doubt about that. Off the backs of other people. So other people create the objects that they sell, and then they sell the object, and they have the tool to sell the object. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that these people at the top aren't thinking people, aren't powerful people, aren't people that have created something above and beyond what others have. Sometimes, of course, they can be quite lucky, like President Trump, and have parents who've had money. They fail numerous times. They're bailed out by the parents, and the parents' contacts are then utilised to move them to the top. And then with their own guile, I guess, and their own understanding, having failed many times and know where the bodies are buried, or indeed know where to move within the shadows, they create something for themselves, but with a great deal of help, which you could argue then anybody else might do if they had that unending opportunity for help. Because oftentimes the difference between an individual who makes it to the top and an individual who doesn't is one in themselves, their own resilience, but also the capacity to have that backup, to have that oftentimes fiscal backup to allow them to fail and restart and fail and restart. And that often comes from parents. And for many, if they don't have that kick up, that start in the beginning, and even educational start oftentimes, to see a concept, put a concept in place, understand where it is, to have made contacts maybe in your school or whatever that allow you to push forward. So, there is a symbiosis of this. It's not just a simple process. It is a process which oftentimes feeds from the bottom through the top to allow you to do something that then allows that to move forward. So the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because when you look at the media, I think it's, for many of these people of power, it's basically like a parent. It's basically the tool that allows them to keep recreating even when they do wrong. And therefore, you probably in the beginning, when you're working your way through to get to the very, very top, I'm talking about billionaires now, not just multi-millionaires, but billionaires in particular, you want to probably make sure that that media angle is taken care of, that you got some control over that media angle. And if you're really, your top multi-billionaire, you will make sure that you have total as can be, control over that media. You're probably even going to try and have some primary anchors in your pocket somewhere along the line. It might not be that you are directly paying the anchor, but you're probably paying the person who runs that particular news system, that then you make sure that it is positive to what you wish to get your message out to. So what does that mean? What am I saying in terms of media and moguls, media and czars, or whatever terminology you want to use, media and, the old British saying of baron? What do I mean? Well, what I mean is, I mean that I think that more than ever before, and you hear the reticence in my voice as I'm saying it, because I'm trying to think when the first newspapers came out, they were probably paid for by somebody, obviously paid for by somebody, but probably controlled at some level by somebody who wanted something out of that newspaper. You wanted that paper to say what you wanted it to say. So even from the beginning, I'm guessing, particularly in the print press, that you didn't have many rogues on the mass mainstream media. Now, what I think did happen is at the same time that others probably banded together. And I know that some political parties were very good at this. Communist Party, example, was very good at this. The Labour Party was very good at this in Britain. Was getting out their own message via their own paper that was potentially or relatively controlled by them or their way of thinking in the collective. So they weren't singular people owning it in one way. The collective may well have bought into it. And then you went into this bill posting, which I guess is the same as the independent media, whereby people posted their own bills, wrote their own bills and posted and stuck them around. And those bills were just to say, this is what we think our position is. And this is what you should follow in your position. And this is how, we're going to meet tonight to talk about what we think this or that is. That's media, that's the fourth estate as well. But of course, what I noticed is that particularly in London, under bylaws of the Metropolitan Police, handed to the Metropolitan Police, bill posting was illegal. So you could see it became a threat to the state, and the state then said, we don't want bill posting, because bill posting was another way of getting your ideas out, which could be anarchic to the state. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying it shows you how the state is already working to prevent other voices coming through. And if you take into account, really, in the beginning, most of Parliament was the wealthy, because otherwise why would you bother with Parliament? So the wealthy had a message, and their message was going through. Now, okay, so you want some sort of bourgeois democracy, so what you do is you say, Anybody can be a member of parliament, but you just need these numbers and you just need these votes. Well, yeah, but you then need an apparatus behind you. And if you don't have the apparatus, you won't get the votes, because independents don't make it without votes and money to make votes. And I think you see that best in the United States. So now you've got a two-party system that works. Independents, unless they're really, really wealthy, or listen to this, or they are supported by the really, really wealthy, yeah, then they're never going to even break open the first part of the door. So the point is this, that again, would you leave then to chance the media, which might open up opportunities? No, you don't. So if you're part of the ruling system, the ruling elite, you want to control that mass media, which you know the vast majority of your citizenry are looking at in some way, shape or means, and you then want to make sure that they get the message that you want to provide to them. Right, so now we have the sort of the yin and the yang, because you're now looking at, is there a message that's positive that you want to give to everybody? So when you get complex societies, and to be fair, all societies are really complex. I know you hear this nonsense about, tribes, you don't know. No, everybody's society is complex, because there's very few tribes that are just 20 people. You know, if there were still tribes in, say, the Amazon or wherever, there are hundreds of people. So that brings in itself a complexity of a community. And you have to get a message for that community and a complexity. And you have to have rules, and you have to have systems, and you have to have controllers. And nobody wants a message going out that then affects that in such a way that fighting breaks out. When we call it as states, we call it wars break out, or when it's not states, it's internal, we call it revolution or rioting breaks out. And so one of the aims of any society has to be to quell those, and if possible, before they even start. So what you want to do is you want to have a message that makes sure that everybody's thinking on what you would see as an even keel. Now, that even keel has got to be sponsored by somebody. So it's sponsored by the people in power. Because even though you put a politician there, if that person isn't from the ruling clique, then the people in power want to make sure that that politician is articulating what he wants them to say. And by that, what you want, he or she, I should say, because I would say in American politics right now, Marianne Edelson is probably the most powerful person standing behind Trump, and it's a female, and she is about war, because she's about war because the system that she's supporting is about war, which is the state of Israel in this case, because the state of Israel feels itself, rightly or wrongly, at threat. So therefore, if you're a true believer, you want that message pushed forward. So you then try and control the person that controls a good degree of the system, and you then want to bring other people behind you, behind that person, and that's where the media comes in. So it's not a gender thing, and to some extent it might not be a religious or a race thing. You may have total beliefs, and those beliefs may be what you play into because of your beliefs, but those beliefs may not really be something that you really believe in, but you know that that's what the masses believe in, so you feed the masses that, so if you look at last week's pod, and people may or may not have thought it's lightweight because I was talking about sport, football, but it's the opiate of the masses. It is a movement greater than any other movement practically on this earth. And if you can control people by that movement, in this case football, and you can, if you will, deaden their senses to other negativity, if you can keep them happy and joyful on football, they aren't thinking about revolution and revolting or even demanding other issues. So these factors are important, and the media can shape all of that. So why wouldn't the media be an area that any would-be controller, ruler, just business person want to control? And as a business person, it's important to put your perspective, selling whatever because effectively business people are selling something. Yeah, even if it's not by their own hand, they're selling something for them to if you will, drag the wealth and drag the opportunity from that. So therefore, why wouldn't you wish to support something that you can see has the ear of the masses, has the eyes of the masses? And hence my football thing last week, right? But switching it to the other side, I could actually see that the vast majority of people on this earth see it as a positive in terms of football. See the game for the game. Don't see the game for the opportunity cost, if you will, in terms of a business person would see it. So therefore, would it be wrong for football to take a hit because of a political dimension that people who really don't see the game but utilise the game want to take advantage of? And I guess you could put it this way. If I were an American who was running for the presidency, I would have to have some religious element to me as it stands at this present moment in time. This might change, but as it stands right now, in this present moment of time, I'd have to have some religious perspective to me. Generally, that religious perspective in the United States presently would have to be some type of Christian denomination. Up until JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, that religious perspective would have had to have been Protestant. So any of its formats of Protestantism, would have had to been. But when JFK broke in, obviously it opened that same religious Christian perspective to become potentially Catholic as well. So why in the United States was Protestantism strong, but in most other places Catholicism was strong because the Pope had backed you. So in other Western countries, let's use the word terminology Western, the Pope had backed you. So for you to get on to be somebody, in many countries, particularly in southern or southeastern Europe, you probably had some sort of Catholic perspective, other than then falling back again into the Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church. Or if you came to the north of Western Europe, you started hitting on the connections between both. So in areas like Germany, example, you could have some states which were Catholic in their orientation, and the person who might win those elections might profess Catholicism. Whereas in the north of Germany, you might have the person who won those having a more Calvinist sort of Protestant perspective and would win those elections. I'm not saying that everybody who went into politics in those areas pretended to be one or the other, but I would suggest to you, if you went in being none, that you might not win those elections. So when I put that to the United States, I put that to England, of course, because the Church of England, if you really wanted to get on in British politics to be the top at one stage, you really did need to have a connection to the Church of England, or not articulate your position. You could be Jewish, and many, many people have been Jewish and got to the top. And now, of course, you can be Islamic in any denomination thereof. Well, the two primary denominations, I would argue, be it Shia or Sunni. And you could get to the top. But you've obviously also had a person whose heritage means that they were potentially a Hindu and got to the top. And so therefore, religion wasn't articulated as much because it didn't give you as much as an advantage. But if you went amongst that community that was Hindu, you would articulate your Hinduism. So that's the way politicians utilise that. And why am I mentioning this in a media programme? Because the media pushes that forward whichever way you wish to push it. That's how you do it. You would speak to your people via the media in whatever religious perspective would be advantageous for you. And why did I bring that back to football? Because in Britain, you cannot be a prime minister and say, I hate football. You just can't do it, even if you did. You can't say, I hate football. So you're going to say, oh, my favourite football team is whatever. Even the Royals get onto this now. So the young Royal says, oh, Aston Villa's my team, and he's sat at the matches, because then you're a man of the people. So I'm not just a Royal, I'm just Joe Soap as well, because I like Aston Villa, which, you know, football is the game of the plebs, it's the game of the normal everyday people. In Britain, you have this perspective where rugby was the game of the higher echelons. But now, because football is all so powerful and all so demanding in terms of politics, and in terms of how the general average person sees football, that you're going to articulate that you're a football fan. Cricket used to be one of these areas that you'd say that brought the people together. So what I'm saying is to you is that this use of media to push a message isn't new, always has been the case, not going to change. But what I am thinking is that it's now much, much more controlled in terms of what the newscasters say, do, think, how the stories are written. Actually, I'm thinking now that for many, particularly international stories, in countries that have really got an understanding of how this media system works, and I think Israel is probably one of the best at this, they basically write the stories for the reporter. And when the reporter turns up to an incident or whatever it might be, the Israeli news media system within the Israeli government have actually written them the copy already and hand them the copy. And they take the copy away and say, great, because now that copy's filed. Good, my job's been eased. I'm sure there are other countries doing it, just the Israelis are very good at it. I'm sure there are other countries that do the same. Write the copy for you, it's done. Fire off, bang, done. Fantastic. The United States, you know, before you could argue that the presidential correspondence pit, I think they used to call it. I absolutely call it because it was, you know, boisterous. Presidential correspondence pit was open to most. Now, under the Trump system, you're finding that he's banning people from the pit. You know, that certain people get access and others won't get access, or others won't be asked to provide questions. You see, there's many ways to skin a cat, as people used to say. So you can have it as though it's totally open. Everybody can turn up to the pit. But when the guy walks around with a microphone, or the gal, you're never going to get the microphone thrust to you. Right? There's many ways of dealing with it. See, this happened in the United Kingdom. I mean, I spoke earlier on about Susanna Reid, who's a famous newscaster, who then moved across to ITV. And she ran a programme called This Morning. Now, she's still on it. Now, this programme, you had a position on, frankly, on Brexit, that one of the news readers, who I'm generally not in tune with, Piers Morgan, because I think Piers Morgan is often very limited in his analysis. And if he were to listen to this, I'd say, Piers, I'll come on your show any day, any time, anywhere, and we can discuss anything. Because I know you come from a limited perspective. Right. But on Brexit, he and I were in tandem. I've got to say that. He and I are in tandem, and I, like him, even though I absolutely hate some of the things that the EU is presently doing under the present EU president, whom I think is an absolute abomination for the EU as a central body, and is actually bringing the EU down in analysis, and bringing the EU, when I say analysis, I'm talking the normal person, when they look at the EU previously, probably thought to themselves, yeah, when I analyse the EU, in general, it's doing good for the people of Europe. Now I look at the EU and I think to myself, actually, it's not doing good for the people of Europe. It's probably doing better for the people of the United States, and it's probably doing better for certain classes of people in Europe, not in generalised European people. So that's the way I would have seen that. So, you know, I have the negatives about the EU, but generally, why would the United Kingdom come out of a body politic that actually gave the United Kingdom power above and beyond its present day reach? And I think that what Boris Johnson was able to do was to go back in time and suggest that Britain was still that island nation that controlled a third of the world's population and a third of the world's assets, much more important than the population, unless when the third of the world's population was needed for wars, then, that was a war pool, that you could utilise, Indian Army, etc. Yeah, but the third of the world's assets, which could then flow back into Britain and make Britain great. Right, so that aspect, and had the markets open, which were controlled by Britain and suppressed to other people who want to get inside to that market. So the circular system of empire was good for the ruling elite of Britain, and to some extent, in a small trickle down, for the public of what those other nations that were part of empire would call England, Ireland in those days, Scotland and Wales, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, would call the mother country. Right? Now, of course, for some Irish, that would never be the case, and we go back to a religious perspective, they're generally Catholics, because they wanted to break away and be their own state, back again after 500 years. But for other Irish in the north, Protestant Irish, they were happy to be part of the British or the United Kingdom system, to be precise, because it's the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, all this United Kingdom of Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in the old days. So, well, now Northern Ireland. So they wanted to be part of that system, and therefore they were pretty happy with the trickle down that came from the ruling, because in all of these parts of Great Britain and the UK, the trickle down came from the top people down to the bottom. So various goods available, various opportunities to create an infrastructure because we could move goods around easier, etc., etc., etc. All of that comes about by creating an empire that creates, if you will, the mortar for you to internally, because it was perceived as internal. This is what people need to understand about empire. It wasn't external. You weren't an immigrant from India. You were part of empire because internally all of the goods that you could push to empire functioned. It's basically like looking at China now, 1.4 billion people, and it can function by actually creating goods and selling them to their own people in a circular motion. It can do that. It could do that without actually selling abroad. Now, the proof of the pie, if you will, the pudding, additional pudding, if you will, is the fact that it sells to the rest of the world because it's so creative. It's got so many opportunities because of this internal market that can feed itself, that it can feed also externally. So you only need to look at Chinese cars, and I did a program on Chinese cars not so long ago. You can see how this position works out when I say I look at the macro and the micro. Creating Chinese cars for the Chinese market, Chinese electric cars for the Chinese market, because it was that big, then allowed them to experiment on cars that could then go to other markets, because you weren't just producing 2 or 3 cars, you were producing millions, and within that, selling those millions of cars, you could have the funds available to do the experimentation, the research and development that one requires to make the best cars and to press them out around the world. Small countries can't do that. They have to try and push out into other countries to start off with. But if you have that populace, and then you have the control system, which is the Communist Party, which I said 9-10 times is not really communism as Marx would see it, but state capitalism. That system has done well for its people. It has given its people an incredible amount of success over the last 50, 60, 70 years. I mean, the Chinese people couldn't dream at the levels of, if you will, wealth they have attained in general. Couldn't have dreamt about the standard of living that they've achieved. Couldn't have dreamt about it. Couldn't have dreamt about the food that they're able to eat, right? Because they've got a system, which is a controlled system, that says this is what we're going to do in the next 5 years, this is what we're going to do in the next 10 years, this is what we're going to do in the next 30 years, yeah, if you will. It's a controlled system. And as a general rule, because it looks after the people, because it doesn't want revolution, it looks after the people, you then get a collective of people working for it. Now, there may be some religious aspect. Confucianism may well play a part of it, but all Chinese are by far not Han Chinese. So straight away, Chinese have got to think to themselves, if we've got 1 billion Han Chinese, but there's 400 million who are not Han Chinese, who are part of China, we need to make this thing not just exclusive, but we need to make it inclusive for all those people who we call Chinese, because they're all inside the borders of China. Now, of course, that's what the United Kingdom attempted to do with its empire. The only difference being, of course, and this is where empires often fall down, is that some people were more, let's argue, how did they put it in Animal Farm? That they're more, that have better rights than others, basically, that's what I'm saying. More equal than others, that was it. And more equal than others. This is the thing. So in empire, you sold to all the imperial peoples around the world, in Africa, Asia, South America, wherever they might be, you are part of empire, right? While taking the goods out, giving a little bit back, because you can't take everything out, because if you do, then you create your own revolution. So taking things out, making sure that the clique at the top was, if you will, and this is where I think Britain went wrong, because it talked of British stock. So the people at the top, they made of British stock. So if we take Hong Kong, for example, Hong Kong was making money for Britain, for sure, for Great Britain, because all that money was coming back around in this circular system, was coming around. But the big mistake they made is they didn't give the Chinese people of Hong Kong all the freedoms given to the British stock at the top. So let's take something as simple as policing. Really, what they did is, for the police, I say simple as policing because police control the masses, so it's important that police are what you want them to be. So Chinese people could join the police for sure, and they could rise up to be a sergeant. But the officer class, inspectors and above, were generally brought directly from Britain to be in the officer stock, right, of good British stock. Now, later on, because they couldn't fill it from Britain only, because Britain did this practically everywhere, and there weren't enough people who wanted to travel out to the colonies to be police or whatever, police, the ruling elite of police inspectors, etc. and above, they had to bring in others. So you could get people from other parts of empire into Hong Kong police at that level of inspector. But generally, you weren't picking Chinese up to do that. The Chinese were the lower ranks. That's how you kept it. Because your danger in Hong Kong was the Chinese rising, not other people who you might have brought in to be the ruling elite from other parts of empire. Even people who didn't look white, so like Indians or whatever, could potentially become, ruling police stock in that particular area, but not Chinese as a general rule. And that was reflected itself in all other parts of the ruling elite of Hong Kong. Now, as time went on, they did begin to allow some Chinese in, because the Chinese are the mercantile class in many places. They begin to earn wealth and get it, and the system suited them because they were making money. So you could co-opt these people into the system at the ruling level, because you knew they were loyal, if you will, for want of the word, to the British system, because it was making them money. So therefore, that was positive, right? And this is the other big thing now. So you had the media, which articulated all of this as normal. So it would show, Dennis Wong has made it to be whatever. Now, Dennis Wong is one who's chosen of many, because the vast majority can't get in, but Dennis have made it. But the media focuses on Dennis and suggests in that focus that every Chinese person in Hong Kong could make that level. Right? But no, because vast majority of them are not co-opted. That's how the media has always worked in these control systems, particularly in colonial type systems. What I've just said about China, Hong Kong, you could put into South Africa, you could put into any other part of the British Empire, right? Any other part of the British Empire. And to be fair, you could have done that with the Roman Empire. To be fair, you probably could have done that with the Egyptian Empire of old, right? Because, what you're talking about is control. And you need systems and organs that can control, that make it advantageous to whatever that ruling elite is. And so what I'm seeing now the difference is what I'm seeing now is that the pretense has gone away from there being allowed into the media circle, the mainstream media circle. And again, hesitating as I'm saying it may be because there are so many openings for individuals that would be rogues, if you will, to the system by, people like me just making podcasts, right? Who may have had to have been in some way, shape or means co-opted into the mass media system. Let's say the 70s, your John Pilger's example, who wasn't singing the tune of Empire, wasn't singing the tune of the West, but did get his programmes on television. How did that occur if you had a controlled system? I think it occurred because people understood there needed to be some counter-argument to a plethora of a particular position. And it may even have been that individuals were much more open to be revolutionary. And by that what I mean is that because the goods had not been... because life wasn't as good as it is for the vast majority, and let's be realistic, if you take the United Kingdom as an example, for the vast majority of people, life is good. Okay, I'll say it again. For the vast majority of people, life is good. When we talk about poverty, it's not a patch on poverty of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Not a patch of it, right? So because life is generally good, maybe the system, I keep talking about this system, and it's not one thing, it's basically flexible, it's basically living, it's amorphous, it's a growing, living process, and it moves backwards and forwards. It's like if you watch those old-fashioned Doctor Who's and you used to see a brain and you get that sound, for non-British or non-UK or imperial, non-old-fashioned imperial peoples from around the world who potentially haven't seen Doctor Who, so maybe in the United States or in the Far East or wherever, where the parts where the British Empire wasn't, you may not have seen Doctor Who coming from the BBC. They used to have things like, Doctor Who and the Daleks, and generally there was a brain that controlled things. And so the flexibility of that brain, its ability to expand or contract as required, generally within those stories, was shown. And that's what I'm saying. So I'm basically saying that the system expands or contracts as required, and it utilises the media in that fashion by expanding or contracting its ability to allow others maybe on those mainstream platforms. I think that I'm now saying that those mainstream platforms are beginning not to bring on board those individuals that may be questionable of what the primary message is. And it might be because the people who directly control the media, the barons who directly control it, no longer have to bend and shape and move to the politic of the politicians at the top. The politicians at the top may now be, if you will, stabled. They may be stabled. What do I mean by that? They may be like a horse that used to, at one stage, run relatively wild within a specific area. They've now been brought into a stable, been broken. The politicians have been broken, brought into stable and broken. And we know exactly what the confines of their movements are. So the barons who run the papers, who run the media, etc., now know they've got them. So if you look at Tony Blair example, one of the first things he did is he went out and did a deal with the media. With the newspapers as it was then. He did a deal with them. I'll deal with your newspaper, bosh. Now, the other thing that newspapers have, and which I'll tell you about before we go, is newspapers actually have a lot of investigative individuals working for them. They have money to open the mouths and the minds and the memories of individuals who may have been working with politicians. And they store this information for a rainy day. I know that as a given. I know that because I was looking at various things, and I know that the news media had them but would never put them out because what they wanted to do was control the politician rather than burn the politician. So these news medias who had all this information on various politicians which would have destroyed them in a moment, right? Don't utilise them because they're keeping them for when they need to utilise them in terms of putting the politician back in his stable and actually orientating the politician to the media baron's perspective of life, whatever that might be. And this is the last bit I'm going to talk about, because the barons are not just trying to fill their pockets, they're also trying to fill their ideologies. And that's probably the most dangerous part, that the barons are filling whatever ideology they might have. They can, because they've got the politicians in a stable, which is where Trump is, because they've got the politicians. Now, Trump should be running free because he's a wealthier politician, but because of that media investigative aspect, the knowledge that they may well have of that individual may well be preventing Trump from doing anything other than what certain individuals want him to do. And this is where intelligence agencies come in. Because intelligence agencies also, and security agencies also collect information, right? And that information may well be collected and may well be kept and may well be utilised in a fashion that they can, working in tandem with the newspapers, or working in tandem with a concept, or working in tandem with a leader, control the movements and the thoughts of individuals, so that then, when that individual reaches the top, they've got something on him. Now, that obviously is oftentimes other states. So another state's intelligence agency has got information on them that makes that person then function in tandem with what that other state wants you to do, rather than your state, you know. And the better the intelligence agency, the Mossad, the CIA, Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service is MI6, that's just its real name. So MI6, who else would be good? The French would probably be good at that. DGST, who else would be good at that? You'd have the Germans, but the Germans often use too much. The Germans are often being compromised from day one, so maybe not be that good at it. I'm trying to think who else might have that worldwide reach that would be able to have knowledge on individuals that they can utilise to carry and push forward their message. Now, there will be agencies that are good within their particular language group. Like I would think the Spanish will have some movement against South Americans or others, because in their particular language group they could pick up information that would be of advantage to them. Obviously the Chinese, obviously the Russians, all of these agencies. Actually, at one stage, the Cubans because it was a matter of life and death. The Cubans were very good at picking up on intel that they could utilise to sort of orientate various individuals to their way, to a lesser degree, obviously. So this is what you've got in the world. You've got this perspective. So you've got this media, then you've got agencies who might work within the media, ostensibly for countries, but then who controls them? That's a more difficult perspective. Who is, in Britain, you'd say the civil service probably have the overview, but even the civil service don't really have the overview of the agencies in Britain. For sure they don't. Then you've got the most powerful agencies, which you never hardly hear about. You'll hear me talk about it now and then, but you don't have it anywhere else. So you will have the National Security Agency, okay? Because you're listening into what people are saying, right? And this will be, I believe, one of the problems for the Germans, because the Germans have been listened into by the NSA forever and a day. Why am I saying that? Because no less a person than President Obama, when he was president, had to apologise to Angela Merkel for listening into everything that she was doing, because the NSA was doing that. So that's what was going on. And I would suggest to you that the person now running the EU and the person who is now the Chancellor of Germany have been listened into forever and a day. And if you listen into people forever and a day, and I'm using that sort of terminology, listening into, you'll know what I mean by that. People who are switched on listening, you'll know what I mean. In terms of listening into people forever and a day, you will have something on those people. There is no doubt about it. If you've been listening to somebody for 20 years, you will have something on those people, something that they don't want to get out. And that then makes you an asset in some way, shape or means. It just depends how much the agency wants to utilise you as an asset, how open they want to be in utilising you as an asset. Sometimes they may use the media to get the story out, or half the story out, which will then make the individual think, I better not go any further because the media's caught on to me, when actually it's the agency that's caught on to you and they've pushed it through the media. Right? So the NSA, very, very powerful. And if it works in tandem, which it does, with the Central Intelligence Agency, it makes it even more powerful, the Central Intelligence Agency, because they're the ones who are going to get the human intel, or utilise that intel to get the humans to function for them in the human intel game. We have a good system. GCHQ listens in very, very well. Good system, works in tandem with the NSA a lot of the time. The Chinese have a good system, listening into individuals, knowing what the score is, and co-opting those individuals that it finds. The Russians obviously have a good system. Part of the old KGB in the old days, then the FSB now, whether it comes under SVR or if it comes under FSB is, questionable which way it works. But they've got the cyber aspects that they can work on. This is what countries do, and then oftentimes the pressure point is the media. Because if I put it in the media, what I've got, you're done, you're finished, you're over. So therefore, best you listen to what I'm saying. What is that in the Israelis got? Is it 22 that they use? System 22? Put it in the media. And when you've got people around in the media around the world in different countries, which example the Israelis will have, because of the polygolic system of the Israeli life, so Israelis, Jewish people come from everywhere nigh on, and so therefore have made the way within systems everywhere, you will have an opportunity to co-opt some of those people into your way. And I think that's what they do very, very well. And to be fair, if you take it down a notch, you could probably see how some other organisations who you wouldn't even dream of would have very good systems. One thing I said years and years ago, I said probably the best intelligence service, or one of the best, or could be if it worked its way around properly, intelligence service in the world would be your Nigerian or your Ghanaian. These are people who are caretakers, cleaners, whatever, in government buildings around the world, because the diaspora is working on any role. They're educated oftentimes. Why would you not utilise that as an avenue if you were an agency to obtain intel? Utilise your people doing that to obtain intel. Brilliant way. So don't see it as one system without people seeing through it into other ways. And so the media then becomes the tool of these systems in that way. So there's a circular motion is what I'm basically saying. You've got the media, which in itself is powerful. You've got the barons who own the media, which are in themselves powerful. You've got even more powerful people who may own the barons, or the barons may be the more powerful people themselves who do it. You've then got the agencies who utilise the media, but the media may utilise the agencies. You've then got countries who supposedly control those agencies, but maybe do or maybe don't, or maybe a section of those people in a particular country that the agencies are favourable to, because what is the agency recruitment? So is it recruiting more one type of people, hence they are happier with one type of people running the country, and so therefore can control it more, are more willing to work with that one type of people in that particular country, and therefore can, if you will, utilise all the tools of the agencies. Again, is a natural affinity between the business class and a class of people who may well run the civil service in many countries? Is there a natural affinity between the barons and certain business class of people? Is there a natural affinity between, from growing up, if you will, from being born into a certain type of people? It could be race, it could be gender, it could be, generally not gender though in one, but it's becoming more so, but it could be a religious belief that allows you to articulate and utilise people from around the world to push your particular religious perspective forward. You know, you can go on and on and on. So this Teufelskreis, as the Germans would call it, this devil's circle, which is probably not even a circle, which is probably a multi-nodal different way of doing it, needs to be controlled by somebody. And I'm not sure, in fact, I'm totally unsure, totally clear, sorry, I should say, that the voted in, if you will, political leadership doesn't control all this. So there are different nodes controlling different factors and different elements. And to me, it's got to be the case that the fiscal aspect, the money, because I always say follow the money, is probably the overall controller of it in general, in some way, shape or means. If there is such a thing as an overall control, which I don't really think there is, but I think there is a symbiosis of people working together to form certain things, which is advantageous to the most, and therefore creates more wealth for the most, and creates least less. When I say the most, I'm talking about the most of the ruling elite, and creates the least less for the hoi polloi, for the normal everyday people. And one of the ways to control the hoi polloi and the everyday people is to pass them a message via the media. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. If you followed that, hats off. But I think it's important when we're looking at this war that's happening, if we're looking at President Trump, if we're looking at Epstein's case, if we're looking at the way Iran has been able to fight back fiscally, etc., 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 I think it's important to understand how the media plays a part in all of that, and the interconnections, or the, if you will, the lumps, the amorphous masses, the expansions and the decretions, if you will, of all of these kind of little systems that are working, how they function, how they could function within your life and within the media, in order for you to think in a certain way and in a certain manner. And with that, if you need to listen again, because it's quite complex, please do, just put it on a loop, listen to it. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll come back to me next week, having thought about how this really works. See you then.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.